for a second. If you recall, in the beginning, all Rahman wanted was an oath of allegiance from everybody because at the time he knew he wasn't in a position to assert his authority. His enemies were still too numerous. Zaragoza in the upper march, Toledo in the middle march, and Badajoz in the lower march were all in the hands of separate lords. And furthermore, the Christians in the north were strong enough to raid the south almost as they pleased. In fact, in 918, Ordoño II and Sancho Garces, the king of Pamplona, even banded together to attack the fortress of Valtierra and burned its mosque to the ground. But of course, this was all going to change with the death of Umar ibn Hafsun and the subjugation of southern Spain. Abd al Rahman III decided to build on his successes and was now in a position to expand his operations from the core territories to the frontier regions. In the year 920, the emir personally led a massive army on an expedition that he named the Muez Campaign. He went deep into both Navarre and Castile before crossing the Ebro River to find his prey. Once across the water, he found Ordoño II and Sancho at the head of their armies, and on July 25th, he proceeded to teach them both a lesson for burning down that mosque in Valtierra. He did this by annihilating both of their forces. The king of Navarre, Sancho Garces, would later regroup and attack Muslim lands in 923. He managed to capture and execute many of the Islamic aristocracy, to which Rahman promptly returned with the army of Cordoba in 924, where he once again personally led his forces on a savage, scorched earth campaign. This time, the capital of Navarre, Pamplona, was the main target. The emir saw to it personally that the city was captured and razed to the ground, including its cathedral. Rahman had that mentality from that movie Untouchables. Every time he puts one of your men in the hospital, you put one of his in the morgue. Was this unnecessarily brutal? Undoubtedly, but it worked. The Christian kingdoms, for the most part, were temporarily subdued. Navarre was wounded, and Leon went into civil war as the people of Castile broke off and started their own country. After inflicting this humiliation on the north, Rahman spent most of the years 924 to 928 subduing the fortress Bobastro, if you recall the last bastion of the Hafsuns that we just talked about. But decidedly, his position of strength in the Iberian Peninsula was becoming more secure by the day. Maribel Fierro again comments on this, quote, "As the poet Ibn Abd Rabihi said, the emir had succeeded in uniting the divided community, lifting the obscure coverings of darkness from it. The moment had arrived to illuminate that community with the light of the Caliphate." End quote. Hugh Kennedy expands on this comment, quote, "By 929, Abd al Rahman III had restored Umayyad power to the peak it had reached under his great-grandfather Abd al Rahman II. The south was under the control of Cordoba, and he had convincingly shown himself as a leader of the Muslims against the infidels. It was against the background of this achievement that he decided to take the title of Commander of the Faithful, or as it's better known, the Caliph." End quote. It was on Friday, January 16th in the year 929, the first day of Dhul Hijjah, the month when the pilgrimage to Mecca occurs, that Abd al Rahman III proclaimed himself Amir al-Mu'minin, meaning Commander of the Faithful, and thus announced to the world that he was now Khalifa, or Caliph. He would be, from this point onwards, God's representative and Muhammad's successor, leader of the religious community, and thus, with his prior successes, he took the name Al-Nasir, meaning victorious. So now his full title would come to, wait for it, Abdullah Amir al-Mu'minin Abd al Rahman al-Nasir Ladin Ullah, meaning Servant of God, Commander of the Faithful, Abd al Rahman, who brings victory to God's religion. This was a dangerous but daring move. The previous emirs of Al-Andalus had never done this. They knew that to do so would directly challenge the established religious authority of the Islamic world. But Rahman found himself in a particularly favorable situation. He had at this point consolidated a formidable hold on Al-Andalus and had defeated his greatest rivals, the Hafsunids. But the emir, now caliph, had his eye also on the Islamic world. The Abbasids, who had overthrown his family in 750, were now in a deplorable situation. They had slid into chaos, were racked by internal discord, and had lost considerable effectual power. Hugh Kennedy described them as a, quote, complete debacle. It was even under their watch that the Black Stone of Mecca was stolen in 928, but it was events in North Africa that really guided this choice to turn the Umayyad Emirate into the Umayyad Caliphate. The Fatimid Caliphate arose in North Africa. They were an Ismaili Shia sect of Islam, meaning that in their interpretation, the caliph needed to come directly from Ali ibn Abi Talib, who was the son-in-law of Muhammad. They professed that their lineage was a direct line from Ali and the Prophet's daughter, Fatima, hence the name Fatimid. Their movement began as Ismaili missionaries were sent to the Maghreb, where their message gained traction from the local Kutama Berbers. These tribes were united and organized into an army, and in 909 this force was able to capture the North African capital of Kairouan. In the time-honored fashion of rebellion, they overthrew the local rulers, the Aghlabids of Tunisia, who were the vassals of the Abbasids. These guys wasted absolutely no time. The leader of this movement, named al-Mahdi Billah, was proclaimed caliph in that same year. Mahdi, by the way, means Messiah, which is how the Fatimids saw themselves. They were the saviors of the world from the heresy of, well, just about everybody else. So bottom line, they were not exactly going to play nice with their neighbors. The expansion of this caliphate began immediately, with armies being raised and sent across North Africa. Morocco was taken pretty quickly. Sicily and Egypt would eventually be captured. But make no doubt about it, they were turning into a major threat for Al-Andalus. In fact, in 921, al-Mahdi, the caliph of the Fatimid, built a new capital city on the coast of present-day Tunisia. He would, of course, name it after himself. He called it Mahdia. And as a side note, I love it when people in history do this. It's just crazy megalomania. This new city would house an impressive shipyard from which the Fatimid navy began to grow. Rahman was compelled to expand his own navy and build watchtowers along the Mediterranean coast just to keep a very watchful eye. But if there could be 2 caliphs and 2 caliphates, why not 3? Rahman knew that to become a caliph meant that he would be gaining legitimacy, and not just to his territory or his official decrees, but to his military moves as well. He wanted to play at the same level as his opponents, and thus the Umayyad Caliphate of Al-Andalus came into being. The now Caliph Abd al Rahman III, also known as al-Nasir, the Victorious, continued to bring Al-Andalus under his domination. But now he could call his conquest a holy war, and many would flock to his banner as a result. In his usual systematic way, he continued to order campaigns with these concrete objectives for his generals. And I'll spare you the minutiae, but I'd recommend you look into this expansion if you get a chance. 928 to 929 saw Merida and Santarem enter the fold. 930, Badajoz and Bija, despite fierce resistance, were crushed. By 932, after suffering a 2-year siege and a devastating famine, the always rebellious Toledo became part of the Caliphate, and just to ensure it would stay that way, Rahman ordered the construction of a citadel within the city to keep an eye on the Toledans. Zaragoza would take a little more time. The Caliph al-Nasir knew he needed a position of strength against the Upper March. He first campaigned against the north in 934 and punished the Christian kingdoms who would relentlessly send reinforcements to aid the south against him. But by 935, he inflicted so much damage that Leon agreed not only to a non-aggression pact, but more importantly to no longer send help to the enemies of Al-Andalus. Thus, al-Nasir now had a free hand to march on Zaragoza, which he did in 936. This siege was going to be a brutal one that dragged on for years. The city was eventually surrounded, and now, with little chance of getting aid from the Christian north, finally surrendered. The triumphant caliph entered the city on November 21, 937, and immediately had the city walls demolished. But the striking thing was, he knew that his hold on the upper march was very tentative. It was never going to be the same type of control he could exert on the southern areas, so Zaragoza, very diplomatically, was given a high degree of autonomy in exchange for its allegiance. Fierro explains, quote, "From 939 onwards, military activity in the upper frontier was left in the hands of the local lords. Each year, the caliph renewed their right to rule over their lands, sending them presents and giving them lavish receptions on their visits to Cordoba. The absence of serious rebellions during the rest of Abd al Rahman III's reign and that of his successor has been taken to mean that the caliph and the local lineages had found an acceptable balance between central control and local autonomy." End quote. In my humble opinion, Rahman was doing an incredible job of uniting his country, but everybody's luck runs out at some point. Peter O'Toole, the actor who played Lawrence of Arabia, was once remembered as saying, quote, "When did I realize that I was God? Well, I was praying and suddenly realized I was talking to myself. What was it that Julius Caesar said? It's only hubris if I fail?" Al-Nasir, in 939, assembled the greatest army he had ever commanded. By some estimates, it was in the 100,000 range, and he was getting really into that whole commanding his troops in person thing. So with this massive force, he started an expedition, a campaign that he called Omnipotence. A bit much, and in my opinion, it's like building the Titanic and then calling it unsinkable. He set off to once and for all deal a decisive blow to the Christian kingdoms, but Navarre, Leon, and Castile had put aside their differences and united under the Leonese king Ramiro II. Called as a taste of what was to come and a testament to the fact that there is strength in numbers, the Christian kingdoms were prepared. On July 19, 939, the two armies met near the walled city of Simancas, and as if to highlight the drama of the moment, Arab chroniclers recorded, quote, "As the army arrived near Simancas, there was an awful eclipse of the sun that covered the earth of a dark yellow amid the day, and it filled us and the infidels with terror, as neither had seen in their life such a thing as this. 2 days passed without either side making any movement." End quote. But once started, the battle would go on for several days, with the Christian kingdoms finally gaining the upper hand against the Caliphate, which had to retreat, but in good order. But as the troops of Cordoba retreated, they made their way through a narrow ravine, which made for an excellent ambush site, a place that Ramiro II and his men were laying in wait. Once this ambush was unleashed, the fight turned into a slaughter. Some of the caliph's army fled and abandoned their posts during the fight, which made the defeat even more complete. Al-Nasir had to run for his own life, abandoning his golden suit of armor and personal Quran in the process. When he got back to Cordoba, he found the people that fled and had his commanders crucified. The Christian kingdoms would live to fight another day, albeit for the time being they quickly eroded into fighting amongst themselves. The Serbian author Dejan Stojanovic said it best, quote, "Even great men bow before the sun. It melts hubris into humility." End quote. Abd al Rahman III would never again command an army in the field. Military conquest and defeat aside, Rahman III had an incredible domestic policy. Compared to his contemporaries, the historical evidence indicates that the Caliphate was progressive. The Caliph was an interesting ruler who would balance firm control, almost oppressive in certain cases, with broad-minded policies. He expanded his government and appointed more advisors, which included Christians and Jews. By 942, in order to get a broader view of his land, he had 16 viziers. Some of these men were former rebels that had been brought back into the fold and were recognized for their shrewd and clever insight. In comparison, in the East, the other caliphs usually only had one vizier. Some claim that he did this to avoid relying too much on any one single person. As I'd mentioned before, he'd also rearrange governors and administrators on a regular basis to ensure that no one got too comfortable in their position, because, after all, that's where revolutions can start. Rahman also made it a policy to offset the established control of the local lords, who were predominantly Arab, by bringing in Berbers and Eastern European slaves known as Sakalibas or Sakalabas for the army. Within the government, he established an extensive bureaucracy with 4 departments that were divided into areas such as intra-administrative correspondence, affairs of the frontier regions, transmission of orders, and my favorite, supervision of complaints and the affairs of the subjects. When it came to his succession, he was the ultimate helicopter parent. He had chosen Al-Hakam, his son, with a Christian concubine who was known as Marjan. He doted on the boy, kept him under close supervision, and groomed him meticulously to lead. The young Hakam would follow him on military expeditions, and Rahman taught him everything he knew. But on the other hand, al-Nasir could smell conspiracy a mile away, and there were attempts at coup, but at various points in his reign, he had members of his own family executed, including one of his own sons, Abd Allah, who he had killed while his court looked on. Again, a strange mix of enlightened policies and outright brutality. Al-Andalus flourished under his guidance. The economy came roaring back. Fiscal expansion and flourishing trade became a standard. The Caliph went so far as to build a new mint and created not just dirhams, which were silver coins, but dinars, which were gold coins, and stamped them with his name. I mean, why not? He was the Caliph after all. The economy was now on a gold-based system. Hugh Kennedy mentions in his book that it would be another 300 years before any European monarch would be able to mint gold coins. This gold, by the way, came in from Africa via the trade routes to sub-Saharan nations. That meant that the navy had to be revamped to protect the convoys. The city of Almeria in southern Spain became a vast port, and Rahman secured the port city of Ceuta in Morocco to monitor his expanding trade routes. From a cultural perspective, religious scholarship was promoted, even to the point that some scholarly criticism was allowed. The Maliki legal system of Sunni law was brought to a new light. Fierro again comments, quote, "The adoption of the Maliki legal system safeguarded the Medianese legal practice that represented orthodoxy. It was as if Medina, the town of the Prophet in the Arab Peninsula, had been relocated in Cordoba. And given that the Umayyads were now the legitimate inheritors of the Messenger of God, it was as if the Prophet himself ruled over Al-Andalus." End quote. From a religious perspective, Christians and Jews, while having a subordinate status, were still free to worship, albeit with a low profile, but were considered protected people, and many were incorporated into government office, despite their religious background. This growing prosperity was felt abroad. Ambassadors were sent to Germany, France, and as far away as the Byzantine court, which, surprisingly, Al-Andalus would have a very warm relationship with. At one point, there was even plans to create an alliance with the Eastern Romans. The court in Constantinople would send diplomats and scholars, translators and artisans, and gifts in the form of books. The great mosque in Cordoba has decor with Islamic script, but done in Byzantine mosaics. It was estimated that 15 tons of glass and other material was needed to make this task work, and all of it was brought in from the city on the Bosphorus. Cordoba, with its population estimated now at 100,000 people, was described by some historians as being a cultural equal to Constantinople. Diplomacy would also work closer to home. In 940, peace was established with Barcelona, and in 955, Ordoño III of Leon asked for peace and was granted this. Now imagine the following scenario. And to me, this is an example of just how progressive al-Nasir was. There was a Queen Toda of Navarre who was Christian, who contacted the Caliph and reminded him of their common ancestry, which, if you recall, Rahman's grandmother was a Basque princess, so Toda wasn't exactly making this up. The Caliph could hardly resist a family request and acquiesced to her demand for an alliance, but it gets better. Queen Toda had a grandson named Sancho, but was remembered by history as Sancho el Gordo, which means Sancho the Fat. Rahman continued his open dialogue with her and sent help for the grandson. He sent a member of his court, a man by the name of Hasdai ibn Shaprut, who was in charge of collecting custom duties. So this was kind of an important guy, who just also happened to be a Jewish doctor. He traveled all the way to Navarre under the Caliph's command, and it was recorded in 958 that he cured Sancho of his obesity. So you have a Muslim ruler helping out his Christian kin by sending in an esteemed Jewish doctor, and this in the 10th century.